Hi, everyone. This is Michael Clark, Managing Director at Agilis. I'm joined by two of my colleagues today, Joe Anzalone and James Walton. Today, we wanted to talk a little bit more about fiduciary responsibilities with pension plan annuity purchases. Joe, let me start with you. Why do pension plan fiduciaries, the committees that oversee these plans, why do they need to worry about their fiduciary responsibilities when selecting an insurer for these transactions?
That's a great question, Michael. I think to start off, I'd make the distinction between what is a fiduciary decision and what is what we call a settler decision. The settler decision can be made by management on behalf of what's good for the company, right? So the decision to have a pension plan in the first place is a settler decision. How generous the benefits should be, these are all decisions that can be made by management in light of what's good for the company. And another settler decision could be the decision to purchase an annuity contract from the pension plan, risk management decision in order what's going to be the best for the company. That being said, once that decision has been made, from whom to buy that annuity contract, that's where we get into the fiduciary role, because that's a role that's going to be using plan assets in order to satisfy benefit obligations to your participants. And that's exactly the type of decision that must be made with the best interests of the participants in mind. And that's what makes it a fiduciary decision. I think there's been a little bit of discussion about what exactly the fiduciary responsibility is for plan sponsors when making that decision. But again, when we think about using plan assets that have been invested in order to provide benefits to participants and disposing of those plan assets in order to provide those benefits for participants, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, that's a duck.
And to highlight the risk, there has been attempted litigation in the past decade against fiduciary committees that were involved in pension risk transfer transactions. And that was not successful, and it was associated with some of the very largest transactions. But I think it highlights the fact that risk is there. The ultimate kind of real risk, of course, is that an insurance company that is selected actually fails, and that failure results in the cut of benefits, which is a very explicit loss of the participants would experience that then could result in legal action against the fiduciaries. So that's the risk. It could happen in 10, 20, 30 years time from the point at which an insurer is selected. And so it's a very long tail risk that kind of exists for a long time. I think the other kind of point to bear in mind that we've seen on the DC plan side as well is that there is increasing activity against fiduciaries associated with pension plans, and the threshold in terms of asset size and pension plan size that has attracted litigation has come down in size. So we've not seen yet a whole host of litigation associated with pension risk transfer. But given that trend and the fact that pension risk transfer is growing in size, more plans are doing it, then clearly that risk is there.
So, James, let me ask you this. What are you seeing from the different providers that are advising fiduciary committees on these annuity purchase transactions? Are they taking fiduciary responsibility for what they're doing or not?
So there is a whole range of providers involved potentially in an annuity purchase. There may be one provider covering every single service, or you may have multiple providers acting in different capacities associated with a transaction. So you have independent fiduciaries, you might have an independent expert, annuity placement consultant, etc. And I think the quick answer to your question is it really varies, and different providers will acknowledge their fiduciary responsibility to different degrees, some not at all, and some very explicitly. And it just depends on the nature of the company and the nature of the engagement. As a rule of thumb, I would say the larger providers who are not acting in an independent fiduciary capacity often don't acknowledge fiduciary responsibility, because the nature of how those firms are set up and the compliance restrictions often means that is not the case. However, there are specific organizations called independent fiduciaries that will not only acknowledge that, but also perform a number of services associated with the transaction to minimize fiduciary responsibility, specifically the actual selection of the insurance company.
Interesting.
Yeah, and James, if I can add to that, I would say, one thing that we think is really important for plan sponsors when dealing with perhaps several different providers is to have clearly defined roles. As you mentioned, there's many providers that kind of stay silent on the subject, don't acknowledge fiduciary responsibility. That perhaps they're trying to avoid a difficult subject, but we think it's really important that plan sponsors understand, and if it's not clear from the engagement, ask the question, are you taking fiduciary responsibility or not? Because there's a general trend in the industry towards making sure that those roles are well defined and the responsibilities are very clear. And if a provider is not being clear about that, we think it's important to get that information. The last thing I'll say on the topic is that there's a current rule about what governs who's a fiduciary. Doesn't explicitly cover the selection of annuity contracts in terms of an advisory role. However, that is something that was discussed in the Obama administration when they were looking to update the fiduciary rule as to explicitly call out advisory services for annuity purchase selection as a fiduciary act. And that right now, we're in August 2022. That no signs that rule might come back again, but that's something that definitely does happen in the cycle of different presidential administrations. So we want plan sponsors to be future-proof and prepared to make sure that they are getting the right assurances and the clear responsibility from their providers when making a selection.
Well, and I like too what you said earlier, Joe, about how these transactions are really a disposition of qualified plan assets. So it's not a big stretch that you have to make to say that, yeah, this really feels like a fiduciary responsibility and one that should be done with the best interest of plan participants at heart. So I think the biggest takeaways is that we want plan sponsor committees to understand their fiduciary responsibilities and duties as it relates to selecting an insurer as part of an annuity purchase transaction. And then two, make sure that you understand what fiduciary responsibility or not that your service providers that you're working with on these transactions are taking on. I think if plan sponsors are doing that, they're setting themselves up to have a successful transaction and be able to fulfill their fiduciary responsibilities with regards to these transactions. James and Joe, thank you again for joining me, and thanks to everyone for watching, and we look forward to speaking with you next time. Thanks and have a great day.